Now, distinctness, intelligibility at all points, is a primary feature in my general design. On important topics, it is better to be a good deal prolix than even very little obscure. But abstruseness is a quality appertaining to no subjects per se. All are alike in facility of comprehension to him who approaches them by properly graduated steps. It is merely because a stepping stone here and there is heedlessly left unsupplied in our road to the differential calculus that this latter is not altogether as simple a thing as a sonnet by Mr. Solomon Seesaw. By way of admitting, then, no chance for misapprehension, I think it advisable to proceed as if even the more obvious facts of astronomy were unknown to the reader. In combining the two modes of discussion to which I have referred, I propose to avail myself to the advantages of peculiar to each, and very especially of the iteration of detail which will be unavoidable as a consequence of the plan. Commencing with the descent, I shall reserve for the return upwards those indispensable considerations of quantity to which allusion has already been made. Let us begin, then, at once with that merest of words, infinity. This, like God or Spirit, and some other expressions of which the equivalents exist in all languages, is by no means the expression of an idea, but the effort of one. It stands for the possible attempt at an impossible conception. Man needed a term by which to point out the direction of this effort, the cloud behind which lay forever invisible the object of this attempt. A word, in fine, was demanded by means of which one human being might put himself in relation at once with another human being, and with a certain tendency of the human intellect. Out of this demand arose the word infinity, which is thus the representative but of the thought of a thought. As regards that infinity now considered, the infinity of space, we often hear it said that, quote, its idea is admitted by the mind, is acquiesced in, is entertained, but on account of the greater difficulty which attends the conception of a limit, unquote. But this is merely one of those phrases by which even profound thinkers, time out of mind, have occasionally taken pleasure in deceiving themselves. The quibble lies concealed in the word, quote, difficulty. The mind, we are told, entertains the idea of the limitless through the greater difficulty which it finds in entertaining that of limited space. Now, were the proposition but fairly put, its absurdity would become transparent at once. Clearly, there is no mere difficulty in the case. The assertion intended, if presented according to its intention and without sophistry, would run thus, quote, the mind admits the idea of limitless through the greater impossibility of entertaining that of limited space, unquote. It must be immediately seen that this is not a question of two statements between whose respective credibilities or of arguments between those respective validities the reason is called upon to decide. It is a matter of two conceptions directly conflicting and each avowedly impossible, one of which the intellect is supposed to be capable of entertaining on account of the greater impossibility of entertaining the other. The choice is not made between two difficulties. It is merely fancied to be made between two impossibilities. Now, of the former, there are degrees, but of the latter, none. Just as our impertinent letter writer has already suggested. A task may be more or less difficult, but it is either possible or not possible. There are no gradations. It might be possible to difficult. It might be more difficult to overthrow the Andes than an anthill, but it can be no more possible to annihilate the matter of the one than the matter of the other. A man may jump 10 feet with less difficulty than he can jump 20, but the impossibility of his leaping to the moon is not a whit less than that of his leaping to the dog star. Since all this is undeniable, since the choices of the mind to be made between the impossibilities of conception, since one impossibility cannot be greater than another, and since thus one cannot be preferred to another, the philosophers who not only maintain on the grounds mentioned man's idea of infinity, but on account of such supposititious ideas, infinity itself, are plain engaged in demonstrating one impossible thing to be possible by showing how it is that some one other thing is impossible too. This, it will be said, is nonsense, and perhaps it is. Indeed, I think it is very capital nonsense, but forego all claim to it as nonsense of mine. The readiest mode, however, of displaying the fallacy of the philosophical argument on this question is by simply adverting to the fact respecting it, which has hitherto been quite overlooked. The fact that the argument alluded to both proves and disproves its own proposition. The mind is impelled, say the theologians and others, to admit a first cause by the superior difficulty it experiences in conceiving cause beyond cause without end. The quibble, as before, lies in the word difficulty. But here, what is it employed to sustain? A first cause, and what is a first cause? An ultimate termination of causes. And what is an ultimate termination of causes? Infinity. The finite. Thus, the one quibble and two processes. By God knows how many philosophers is made to support now finity and now infinity. Could it not be brought to support something besides? As for the quibblers, they at least are insupportable. But to dismiss them, what they prove in the one case is identical to nothing which they could demonstrate in the other. Of course, no one will suppose that I here contend with the absolute impossibility of that which we attempt to convey in the word infinity. My purpose is to show the folly of endeavoring to improve infinity itself, or even our conception of it, by any such blundering ratiocination as that which is ordinarily employed. Nevertheless, as an individual, I may be permitted to say that I cannot conceive infinity, and am convinced that no human being can. A mind is not thoroughly self-conscious, not accustomed to the introspective analysis of its own operations, will, it is true, often deceive itself by supposing that it has entertained the conception of it which we speak. In the effort to entertain it, we proceed step by step. We fancy point still beyond point. And so long as we continue the effort, it may be said, in fact, that we are tending to the formation of the idea designed, whilst the strength of the impression that we actually form it, or have formed it, is in the ratio of the period during which we keep up the mental endeavor. But it is in the act of discontinuing the endeavor of fulfilling, as we think, the idea of putting the finishing stroke, as we suppose, to the conception, that we overthrow at once the full fabric of our fancy by resting upon some one ultimate and therefore definite point. This fact, however, we fail to perceive, on account of the absolute coincidence in time between the settling and down and upon the ultimate point and the act of cessation in thinking. In attempting, on the other hand, to frame the idea of the limited space, we merely converse the processes which involve the impossibility. We believe in a God. We may or may not believe in finite or infinite space, but our belief in such cases is more properly designated as faith. And it is a matter quite distinct from that belief proper, from that intellectual belief, which presupposes the mental conception. The fact is that upon the enunciation of any one of that class of terms to which infinity belongs, the class representing thoughts of thought, he who has a right to say that he thinks it all feels himself called upon not to entertain a conception, but simply to direct his mental vision towards some given point in the intellectual firmament where lies a nebula never to be resolved. To solve it, indeed, he makes no effort, for which, with a rapid instinct, he comprehends not only to the impossibility, but as regards all human purposes, the inessentiality of its solution. He perceives that the deity has not designed it to be solved. He sees at once that it lies out of the brain of man, even how, if not exactly why, it lies out of it. There are people, I am aware, who, busying themselves in attempts at the unattainable, acquire very easily, by dint of the jargon they admit, among those thinkers that they think with whom darkness and depth are synonymous, a kind of cuttlefish reputation for profundity. But the finest quality of thought is in its self-cognizance, and with some little equivocation, it may be said that no fog of the mind can well be greater than that which, extending to the very boundaries of the mental domain, shuts out even these boundaries themselves from comprehension. It will now be understood that in using the phrase infinity of space, I make no call upon the reader to entertain the impossible conception of an absolute infinity. I refer simply to the utmost conceivable expanse of space, a shadowy and fluctuating domain, now shrinking, now swelling in coordinates with the vacillating energies of the imagination. Hitherto, the universe of stars has always been considered as coincident with the universe proper, as I have defined it in the commencement of this discourse. It has always been either directly or indirectly assumed, at least since the dawn of intelligible astronomy, that were it possible for us to attain any given point in space, we should still find on all sides of us an interminable succession of stars. This was the untenable idea of Pascal when making perhaps the most successful attempt ever made at paraphrasing the conception for which we struggle in the word universe. It is a sphere, he says, of which the center is everywhere, the circumference nowhere. But although the intended definition is in fact no definition of the stars, universe of stars, as we may accept it, with some mental reservation as a definition, rigorous enough for all practical purposes of the universe proper, that is to say, of the universe of space. This latter, then, let us regard as, quote, a sphere of which the center is everywhere, the circumference nowhere, unquote. In fact, while we find it impossible to fancy an end to the space, we have no difficulty in picturing to ourselves any one of the infinity of beginnings. As our starting point, then, let us adopt the Godhead. Of this Godhead in itself, He alone is not imbecile. He alone is not impious to who propounds nothing. Says the Baron de Bielefeld, we know absolutely nothing of the nature of or essence of God in order to comprehend what He is. We should have to be God ourselves. We should have to be God ourselves? With a phrase so startling as this, yet ringing in my ears, I nevertheless venture to demand if this our present ignorance of the deity is an ignorance to which the soul is everlastingly condemned. By Him, now at least incomprehensible, by Him, assuming Him as a spirit, that is to say, as not matter, a distinction which, for all intelligible purposes, will stand well instead of a definition. By Him, then, existing as spirit, let us content ourselves tonight with supposing as to have been created, or made out of nothing, by dint of His volition. At some point of space with which we will take as a center, at some period into which we do not pretend to inquire, but at all events immensely remote, by Him, then again, let us suppose to have been created. What? This is a vitality momentous epoch in our considerations. What is it that we are justified? That alone we are justified in supposing to have been primarily and solely created. We have attempted a point where only intuition can aid us, but now let me recur to the idea which I have already suggested, and is that alone which we can properly entertain of intuition. It is but the conviction arising from those inductions or deductions of which the processes are so shadowy as to escape our consciousness, elude our reason, or defy our capacity of expression. With this understanding, I now assert that an intuition altogether irresistible, although inexpressible, forces me to the conclusion of that what God originally created, that the matter which, by dint of His volition, He first made from His spirit or from nihility, could have been nothing but matter in its utmost conceivable state of what? Of simplicity? This will be found in the sole absolute assumption of my discourse. I use the word assumption in the ordinary sense. Yet I maintain that even this, my primary proposition, is very, very far indeed from being really a mere assumption. Nothing was ever more certainly, no human conclusion was ever more, in fact, more rigorously deduced. But alas, the processes lie out of the human analysis. At all events, are beyond the utterance of the human tongue. Let us now endeavor to conceive what matter must be when, or if in its absolute extreme of simplicity. Here the reason flies at once to imparticularity. To one particle, a particle of one kind, of one character, of one nature, of one size, of one form, a particle, therefore, quote, without form and void, unquote, a particle positively a particle at all points, a particle absolutely unique, individual, undivided, and not indivisible only because who created it, by dint of his will, can, by an infinitely less energetic exercise of the same will, as a matter of course, divide it. Oneness, then, is all that I predicate of the originally created matter, but I propose to show that this oneness is a principle abundantly sufficient to one account for the constitution. The existing phenomena in the plainly inevitable annihilation, or at least the material universe, the willing into being the primordial particle, has completed the act, or more properly, the conception of creation. We now proceed to the ultimate purpose for which we are to suppose the particle created. That is to say, the ultimate purpose, so far as our considerations yet enable us to see it, the constitution of the universe from it, the particle. This constitution has been effected by forcing the originally and therefore normally one into the abnormal condition of many. An action of this character implies reaction. A diffusion from unity under the conditions involves a tendency to return into unity, a tendency ineradicable until it's satisfied. But on these points I will speak more fully hereafter. The assumption of absolute unity in the primordial particle includes that of infinite divisibility. Let us conceive the particle then to be not only totally exhausted by diffusion into space. From the one particle as a center, let us suppose to be irradiated spherically in all directions to immeasurable but still to definite distances in the previously vacant space. A certainly inexpressibly great yet limited number of unimaginably yet not infinitely minute atoms. Now, of these atoms, thus diffused or upon diffusion, what conditions are we permitted to not to assume, but to infer, from consideration as well as of their source? As of the character of the design apparent in their diffusion, unity being their source, and difference from unity, the character of design, manifested in their diffusion. We are warranted in supposing this character to be at least generally preserved throughout the design, and to form a portion of the design itself. That is to say, shall be warranted in conceiving continual differences at all points from the uniquity and simplicity of the origin. But for these reasons, shall we be justified in imagining the atoms heterogeneous, dissimilar, unequal, inequidistant? More explicitly, are we to consider no two atoms as at their diffusion of the same nature, or of the same form, or of the same size, and after fulfillment of their diffusion into space is absolute distance, each from each to be understood of all of them? In such arrangement, under such conditions, we most easily and immediately can comprehend the subsequent and most feasible carrying out to completion of any such design as that which I've suggested. The design of variety out of unity, diversity out of sameness, heterogeneity out of homogeneity, complexity out of simplicity. In a word, the utmost possible multiplicity of relation out of the emphatically irrelative one. Undoubtedly, therefore, we should be warranted in assuming that all that has been mentioned, but for the reflection. First, that supererogation is not presumable of any divine act. And secondly, that the object supposed in view appears as feasible when some of the conditions in question are dispensed with. In its beginning, as when all are understood immediately to exist. I mean to say that some are involved in the rest, or some so instantaneous a consequence of them as to make the distinction impreciable. Difference of size, however, for example, will at once be brought about through the tendency of one atom to a second, in preference to a third, on account of particular inequidistance, which is to be comprehended as a particular inequidistances between centers of quantity and neighboring atoms of different form. A matter not at all interfering with the generally equable distribution of the atoms. Distance of a kind, too, is easily conceived to be merely a result of differences in size and form taken more or less conjointly. In fact, since the unity of the particle proper implies absolute homogeny, we cannot imagine the atoms as at their diffusion differing in kind without imagining at the same time a special exercise of the divine will at the emission of each atom, for the purpose of effecting in each change of its essential nature. So fantastic is an idea as the less to be indulged as the object proposed is seen to be thoroughly attainable without such minute and elaborate interposition. We perceive, therefore, upon the whole, that it would be supererogatory and consequently unphilosophical to predicate of the atoms in their view of the purposes anything more than differences of form at their dispersion, with particular inequidistance after it, all other differences arising at once out of these, in the very first processes of mass constitution. We thus establish the universe on a purely geometrical basis. Of course, it is by no means necessary to assume the absolute difference of even of form among all atoms irradiated, any more than absolute particular inequidistance from each. We are required to conceive merely that no neighboring atoms are of similar form, no atoms which can ever be approximate until their inevitable reunition. Reunition at the end. Although the immediate and perpetual tendency of the disunited atoms to return into their normal unity is implied, as if I said, in their abnormal diffusion, still it is clear that this tendency will be without consequence, a tendency and no more, until the diffusive energy, in ceasing to be exerted, still shall leave it in the tendency free to seek its satisfaction. The divine act, however, being considered as determinate and discontinued on fulfillment of the diffusion, we understand at once a reaction. In other words, a satisfiable tendency of the disunited atoms to return into one. But the diffusive energy being withdrawn and the reaction having commenced in the furtherance of the ultimate design, that of the utmost possible relation. This design is now in danger of being frustrated in detail by reason of that very tendency to return which is now to effect its accomplishment in general. Multiplicity is the object, but there is nothing to prevent proximate atoms from lapsing at once through the now satisfiable tendency before the fulfillment of any means proposed in multiplicity into absolute oneness among themselves. There's nothing to impede the aggregation of various unique masses at various points of space, in other words, nothing to interfere with the accumulation of various masses, each absolutely one. For the effectual and thorough completion of the general design, we thus see the necessity for a repulsion of limited capacity. A separation something which, on withdrawal of the diffusion volition, shall at any same time allow the reproach and forbid the junction of the atoms, suffering them infinitely to approximate while denying them positive contact. In a word, having the power up to a certain epoch of preventing their coalition, but no ability to interfere with their coalescence in any respect or degree. The repulsion already considered as so peculiarly limited in other regards must be understood, let me repeat, as having power to prevent absolute coalition only up to a certain epoch. Unless we are to conceive that the appetite for unity among the atoms is doomed to be satisfied never, unless we are to conceive that what had a beginning is to have no end. A conception which cannot be really entertained, however much we may talk or dream of entertaining them. We are forced to conclude that the repulsive influence imagined will, finally, under pressure of the unitendency, collectively applied but never in no degree until, on fulfillment of the defined purposes, such collective application shall be naturally made, yield to a force which at that ultimate epoch shall be the superior force made precisely to the extent required, and thus permit the universal subsidence into the inevitable. Because original and therefore normal one. The conditions here are to be reconciled as are difficult indeed. We cannot even comprehend the possibility of their consolation. There, nevertheless, the apparent impossibility is brilliantly suggestive. That the repulsive something actually exists, we see. Man neither employs nor knows a force sufficient to bring two atoms into contact. This is but well established proposition of the impenetrability of matter. All experiment proves, all philosophy admits it. The design of the repulsion, the necessity for its existence, I have endeavored to show, but from all attempt at investigating its nature, have religiously abstained. This on account of the intuitive conviction that the principle at issue is strictly spiritual, lies in a recess impervious to our present understanding, lies involved in a consideration of what now, in our human state, is not to be considered. In a consideration of spirit in itself, I feel in a word that here the God has interposed, and here only, because here and here only, the not demanded the interposition of the God. In fact, while the tendency of the diffused atoms to return into unity will be recognized at once as the principle of the Newtonian gravity. What I've spoken of as a repulsive influence prescribing limits to the immediate satisfaction of the tendency will be understood as that which we have been in the practice of designated now as heat, now as magnetism, now as electricity. Displaying our ignorance of this awful character and the vacillation of the phraseology with which we have endeavored to circumscribe it.